Hi everyone, welcome to JavaTechie. In this tutorial, we'll understand how to map a many-to-many bidirectional relationship using Spring Data JPA and MySQL. Okay, alright. These many-to-many relationships are one of the most commonly used association mapping in real time because in real time while working with entity, we always need to maintain their mappings to not lose any information. Okay, so to make it more simple, let me walk you through one happy scenario which is the perfect example to demonstrate many-to-many association mapping. So if you can see these two entity, we have something called students and we have course. So if you think from the real-time perspective, a student can purchase many course. Okay. Similarly, if you think in the reverse direction, a single course can be purchased by multiple students. So if you observe carefully, from student to course, it is one to many. One student can purchase multiple course. Similarly, a single course can be purchased by multiple students. So here, if I use one to many in both the sides, then it's difficult for me to maintain the primary and foreign key mapping. So to overcome this kind of conflict, rather than use one to many in both the place, we can directly use many to many association mapping, where if you are using many-to-many association mapping, behind the scene it will create an additional database table to hold the primary key of both the relationship table like student and course, which makes schema mapping quite easy and understandable. I will show you this once we start the implementation. Okay, so without any further delay, let's create a new project from scratch and understand this many-to-many mapping. So let's get started. Let me go to my IntelliJ IDEA. Then we'll create a new project. Click on File, New, click on Project. Then click on Next. I'll give the group ID com.javatechie. Then I'll give the project name JPA many to many. Okay. I'll give the same as my project name. Then I will change the JDK version to 8 and I will also give the package name com.javatechie. That's it. Click next. You can give any valid name here. I'm just giving JPA many to many. Okay. Now click on next. Let's add all the required dependency. I will add Lombok. Then I will add web dependency. Then since I want to interact with database to use this many to many, I will use the Spring Data JPA dependency. Also I will use the MySQL connector. Okay. Lombok, web, JPA and MySQL. That's enough I guess. Let me click on next. Finish the project. So project imported successfully. Now next what I need to do, I'll just create a couple of packages. Okay, let me minimize this. I'll quickly create couple of packages. I'll just create a package called entity. Then I'll just create a package called repository. You can give any name. Okay, you can give DAO as well. I'm just giving repo. Now next, I don't want to create the service. Better I will directly inject the repo, but it's good practice to create a service layer. Since I am just demonstrating about the association mapping, I will focus on the mapping part. Okay, so I am not going to create service. So I'll just create another package called controller. That's fine. Now, if you observe the flow diagram, we need to create two entity, right? Student and course. So let me create these two entity inside entity package. Create a Java class called student. Then I'll create another class called course. Okay. Fine. Let me zoom this. Now from the student, I need to write association mapping so that student can map to multiple course. Similarly, from course, I need to write the mapping. A single course can map to multiple student. So to make this entity, first I need to annotate @entity annotation. Then I need to annotate table. You can give the table name. Let me give the name as student TBL. Now you can define couple of field. Okay. So I can define the field like ID, name, age and department of student. Okay. Now I just need this ID to be auto generated. So I will just use ID and I just want it to be generate value. This will auto generate my ID. Now the next, from the student I need to map list of course or set of course, right? So what I will do, I will just define private set of courses. Okay. Since I used Lombok, I don't need to write the getter setter manually. I can use the annotation setter. You can use getter. Then I just want all argument constructor. I just want no argument constructor. Instead of writing @setter and getter, I can directly use @data. But there is some issue. If I will write @data in case of multiple mapping, JSON or Jackson is unable to bind those information. Okay, there is keep looping the Stack Overflow error I faced. So it's good practice to keep getter and setter if you are working with entity mapping. Now this course I need to tell to the JPA, this is the student, I want to inject multiple course. So as for the flow diagram, you just create another table and map the primary key of student and course. So that is what I need to define using annotation. So just use the annotation @many to many. Okay. Then I will specify the fetch type. I can specify lazy. Then you can also need to define the cascade type all. You can make it persist, but let's keep it all. Okay. Now the main important thing here, you need to define the join table. You need to tell to the JPA to create one additional table with the information I am giving in this annotation. So you need to define the annotation called join table. Okay. Instead of many to many in other association mapping, you can directly use join columns. But in case of many to many, you want Hibernate or JPA to create a new additional table for you. So you need to define the table information. So I will tell Hibernate or JPA create a table with name student course. Okay. Now next, what you need to do, you also need to define the join column information. So I tell to the JPA, this is what the table create at runtime and just use below mappings. Okay, when I say below mappings, you can say join columns and then you can define the join columns what need to be keep inside this particular table. So in this join columns, what I need to do, I will use an annotation called join column. This is a single column I am defining. The name of the column is student ID. Okay, and then referenced column name is the ID of my student. See, if you observe this student entity, when this table will create by JPA, I am telling him to keep this particular ID of the student with a column name student.id. So that is what we just specify here, right? Student.id should be the column name and it will point to the or it will refer to the ID of my student. Fine. Similar way, I also need to tell about the course details, right? So what I will do here, I will define another join column for course. So I will just add enter inverse join columns. Then I will define annotation @join column. Then I will tell to the JPA use the column name which is course ID and refer to the column name ID. Okay, this ID is the primary key of course table. The way this ID is primary key of student table, Similarly, we need to create another primary key in course as well. So what this table will contains, it will keep the information about your primary key of student, primary key of course. Okay, that's it all about many to many association mapping that we did from the one end, from the student side, right? Similarly, we need to do in the course entity as well. So anything else, that's fine, because we no need to add anything. We added getter setter, yeah, that's fine. Now let's go to the course entity. And since, okay, let me copy directly from here. These are the annotation we need to define in course. I'll just change the table name to course table. Okay, now here also I need to add couple of field. First I will define id, right? Private, then I can define int, better let me keep as a long id. Then I need to annotate @id, then generated value. Then next I will add couple of field: title, abbreviation, modules and fees of the course. Now the next, the way we define a student can use set of course. Similarly, from the course I need to define a course can be purchased by multiple student or set of student, right? So here also I need to define private set of student students. Okay, let me import this. Now here also you need to define the annotation. Now here also I will define many to many, but I will not define the joint tables information in this particular course, because student is my parent or the owner table is student. With the help of student I am going to map the multiple course. Okay, so you no need to define all the information in the second entity, which is the child entity, or you can consider not the owner. Okay, so to tell to the JPA that the owner is students, what I will use, there is another, there is an attribute called map by, and I need to tell to the Spring or JPA that this is not the owner entity. The owner entity is something different, which is student. That is what we defined here. Okay. Then I will also specify the fetch, not here. Fetch, you can define fetch type lazy. Okay. Hope this mapped by is clear for you. If not, let me repeat it. Mapped by attribute indicate the entity that owns the bidirectional relationship. In a bidirectional relationship, we use many to many annotation defined in both the entity, right? But only one entity can own the relationship, and we have picked that student. Okay, that is why from the course entity I define mapped by. So we are good with the entity, and then next what we need to do, we need to create a repository. I mean, since we have two entity, we need to create two different repo. So I'll just create a Java class. It should be interface. I'll give the name as student repository. Okay. Then I'll create another one called course repo. Java class. I'll just change the class name to course repo. Now this should also interface. Now the next step, what you need to do, we need to extend this from JPA repository, because we are using Spring Data JPA, and define the data type of your primary key, which is long, and then the next attribute should be your entity, which is course. Okay. Similarly, go to the student repo. Let me zoom this. Extends it from JPA repo. Define, okay, I reverse it, right? This should be course. Like the second argument should be data type, and this should be long. Similarly for student, this should be student. The first attribute in the type generic should be always your entity, and the second attribute you can see here, right? T extend subject, ID extend subject. So second attribute should be data type of your primary key. So we are good. We created entity, we created its corresponding repository. Now the next step, to make the connection from my Java application to the MySQL, I need to define the data source properties inside this application.properties file, right? So I have those key and value handy with me. Let me add it. Let's paste it. Command B. Fine. Now if you observe, I just define the driver class name, URL, username and password, and this Hibernate DDL auto I keep as update, so that Hibernate will create the table for me. If it is already exist, it will update. Okay, and then we just define the dialect and we define the server port, which is 9191. That is fine. Now what we can do, let's add few method in our repo. Okay, so in student repository I just want to write one method to find a student if that input contains the specific field. So I will write something like this. There is a, if you know Spring Data JPA, there is a method find by, then give the name and then defining containings. Next just give the input, which is nothing, string name, and it will return me the list of student object, right? List of, fine. So this is pretty simple, guys. If you know Spring Data JPA, find by should be the prefix and the next field name is the part of my entity. If you will go and check in student, I have the field called name. If that field is not exist, then this particular method won't work. So always find by is the prefix and the field based on what you want to do the operation. I'm just, this is kind of contents check. Okay, if the input what I will give, if that is exist, then it will give me the list of student object. That's it. Fine. Similarly, we'll write some method in course repo. So here I will write some method who will return me the list of course based on the amount what I will give if that is less than the price. Okay. So I'll write something like find by fee then less than. That is the aggregate method or aggregate attribute defined in Spring Data GPA. Less than, give the fees, double fee. Okay, it will also return me the list of course. So I'll just write list of course. So we are good. We have all the data source configuration. We created entity, we created repository. Now the next step, we need to access the, or we need to save the student along with the course. So for that I could use the command line runner and I can hard code the object, but rather than doing that I will create a endpoint who will do that. Okay, I'll create a Java class. Let's say what I will give the name, any name, student course controller. Okay, let me zoom this. Now since this is my controller, I need to annotate at the rest controller. Then I need to define one root URL, request mapping. So I'll just give something like students. You can give any, since we are dealing with the two entity, I'm just giving students, but you can define the course as well, or better let me do student course. Okay, this is the root URL. Now the first thing, I need to inject both the repository here. Again I am repeat, this is not a good practice to inject directly your repository to the controller. You should have write one separate layer which is service layer. Since this is a demo video, I avoiding writing the service layer. Okay, that is the reason I am injecting the repo directly in the controller. So I'll just use private student repository, student repo. Similarly, I will just inject private course repo. Now I can directly inject using auto add, but I would like to use the constructor injection here. Okay, I will just define both. This is fine. Okay, now let me enter it. Now let's define our endpoint. So I will write one endpoint who will take the student object from the Postman along with course and will save in the student repo. So I will write something like this, public After save it, it will return me the student object. Save student with course. Okay. Now here I need to give the input as a student because student contains set of course. So while building the student object, you need to pass the set of course from the Postman. I need to define at the rate request body. Then I need to define this as a post mapping. Okay, if you want, you can give any URL, but it's fine. I don't want to give any URL since I define the root URL. So now we injected the student repo. I can directly use student repo dot save the student object, and I will directly return that. Okay. Now next I will write a method who will return me the list of student. Once I will fetch list of student, it should display me the list of course purchased by that particular student. Okay, simple guys. If I will fetch the student object, I can get the set of course as well, right? Because the cascade type and fetch I set to the lazy. Okay, so I'll just write the method public will return me the list of student, find all students, something like that. Then I'll simply return student repo dot find all. I need to define this as a get mapping. Now I will write another endpoint who will return me the student, particular student object based on the student ID what I will give. Public who will return me the student object, find student. I will give ID as an input. Okay. Now I can directly use return student repo dot find by ID. It will take student ID, which is long actually. I should not give as a string. Okay, I just need to define post mapping. Sorry, this need to be get mapping because I'm going to fetch the info, right? And I need to define this as a path variable so that as part of URL I can pass the student ID. Now if you observe, this will return as the optional. So I'll just use get, or I can directly use get the object. If not, just return me the null. Fine. Now let's call these two methods. This is what we define from the student repo and course repo. So I'll just use these two methods. One will give me the student list of student by name. Okay. Public will return me the list of student. Find students containing by name. Give the input string name. I can define the path variable again. Then I can define get mapping. Then next what I need to do, I need to call that method, right? Return student repo dot find by name containing. Give the input as a name. So this is simple. What I'll do, I'll just modify the URL. It's not required, but let's keep it simple. Find, then give the name as a input. Now the next method, to fetch list of course based on the price, I will give. Public will again return me the list of course. Find course less than price. The price which I'll give, it should be double. Again, I can use the request param, but let's use the path variable. Okay, because without this information I cannot perform that particular operation. So I'll just use get mapping course search, then give the price. Fine. Then I just need to call course repo dot find fee less than the price. We are good now. We define all the endpoint. One will save student along with the course. One will fetch all the students along with course, and one will fetch single student based on the student ID. And then find student containing by name, and then course less than the price. What I will give the input. So we are good now. Let me start the application. Go to the main class. This is the main method. I will directly run this. So there is some exception, mapped by reference as unknown target entity. Just give me a second, let me check it. So mapped by reference as unknown target entity property, entity student dot course. Okay, if you'll go on student and check, okay, this is what the mistake we did. The attribute name courses, not course. So go to the course and change the mapped by to this particular name. Okay, fine. Let me start it again. So if you observe, it created the table, student table, and then you can observe here, right? It created a table called student underscore course underscore table. This is what the additional table we created, and that's the reason we annotate many to many with joint tables. And student course table, all the course table, okay, all the four table, I guess, right? Two for entity, one for Hibernate sequence, one for the mapping table. Now let's verify that. Let's go to the database. Let's open this. Then I'll just refresh this. You can see here table name course table, student table, and student underscore course underscore table. This is what the mapping table, and we have the Hibernate sequence. Now let's go to the Postman and we'll try to hit the endpoint, this one, to add a student along with course. Okay, so the first endpoint is slash student slash course. Let me go to the Postman. Then I'll create a new request, type post, because we want to add the student object, right? HTTP localhost 9191. Then the URL, let me check the URL, slash student slash course slash student slash course. Then I just need to give the payload, right? So I'll just use JSON. I have the payload, I created this. So if you observe, just give me a second, what is the error? Let me paste it again. Fine. So the name of the student is this, age is 33, department is UI, and he used or he purchased these are the course. Course 1 is Angular and 2 is the React. Now let me send the request. You can see here the ID is auto generated and the course ID is 2 3. This should not be happen actually. I just used at the rate generated value. That is the reason it is getting changed actually. So you should use identity generator rather than at the rate generated value, but that's fine. The student ID begin with 1, so that is the reason in the sequence table the ID 1 is already exist. So for the course the ID got start from the 2, it should start from the 1. You can give a try, guys. This is not something complex. Rather than use this generated value, you can use generator type or something. You need to define identity or something like that, or I guess you can directly use the strategy and you can define your generator, something like generation type or generator type dot something. You can see here generation type auto identity sequence. So it's good to use the identity. Okay, if you'll use, then the sequence will be generated or decided by Hibernate, rather than if you observe here we have something called Hibernate sequence table. So in our case already ID1 is created and stored in the Hibernate sequence. So when we are adding the course, it is taking from the next sequence, which is 2. That is fine. That you can look into the generator type. Now let me add one more object. Just replace with the new payload. So the name is Basant, age 30, and department is Dev. He is purchasing these are course, machine learning, Spring Boot, database system. Now let me send the request. You can see here ID started from 4. For the student, the ID should be start from 2. This is because of our default generator we added. That is fine. Now let's verify in the database. Now what I'll do, I will just create a SQL editor, new. I'll directly check in the student table, select star from student table. Okay, I will run this. You can see here there are two student, ID 1 and 4. Okay, now let me check the course table. There should be 5 course. Okay, select star from course table. You can see here there are 5 course, 2, 2 and 3 ng and React.js added by Santosh, and 5, 6, 7 added by Basant. Okay, that you can view in the student course table. Now select star from student course table. Okay, so make sure to remember the ID so that I can tell you. The ID is 1 Santosh, 4 is Basant. So under this particular ID 1 Santosh, you can see two course ID mapped to this particular table. Similarly for course ID student ID 4, which is Basant, for him there should be 3 course ID mapped to this table. Okay, I will show you directly. You can see here student ID 1, who is Santosh, purchased. These are the two course, and those course IDs 2, 3. But for user Basant, he purchased the 3 course 5, 6, 7. And if you observe the course ID of 5, 6, 7, you can understand 5, 6, 7, which is a Spring Boot database system and machine learning. That is what we pass as part of payload, right? Machine learning, Spring Boot database system for Basant, and his ID is 4. Fine, we are good with the post mapping, and we are able to see that JPA is generating the additional table and keeping the all primary key mapping information. This is what, right? Now let's fetch the all the student. So what I'll do, the URL, let me check, go to the entity or go to the controller, find all, there is no URL. So I will directly change it to the get. I'll remove the payload. I'll send the request. There is some error. If I'll open the console, Stack Overflow null. Yeah, this is what I was talking about. So if you remember, in beginning I used a getter and setter rather than use data. Since course student having list of course and again course having list of student, that is bit conflicting for Jackson data binding to what I can say, to map that to the object. Okay, so there are two annotation. Let me use that. Just go to the entity, then I will directly use here. There is annotation Jackson. Okay, there is something called Jackson managed reference or something like that, or something JSON managed reference, and then go to the other one, course JSON back reference. Okay, this is what using the JSON we are telling to the, or we are just defining to the Jackson bind. Use these two annotation to bind the JSON to the object. Let me restart it. It will take few seconds. So it started. Now go to the Postman, hit the endpoint. We are seeing the response error now. Okay, there are two objects we added, student object, student id 1 Santosh obtained for these two course, id 4 student Basan, these are the course. Okay, now let me fetch a student by its id. So that is what the another endpoint we define, student id, right? Let's say student id, I will search for me the id is 4, I will fetch it for 4. You can see here, if I will fetch for 1, I will get the response for Santosh. Now what next we have, find by name containing. Okay, so I will do something like this. I will directly go to the Postman and I will do find. I will give BA. Okay, now send the request. You can see here the name starts with or containing this character. I'm getting that response. If I will add something S, I can see Santosh. Even Basant is there because S contains in this particular name. Similarly, let's try the another endpoint to find out the course based on the price or based on the price comparison. So the URL is search and price, right? So I'll just change it to search and price is, let's say I'm giving 2000. All the course which is less than 2000 give me as a response. There are only two course, React.js and database system you can get in the 2000. Now let me increase it to the 3000. There are one more course you can obtain using the 3000, means this is just aggregate function to use the less than in Spring Data JPA. But our intention to understand the many to many association mapping, how we can do in the Spring Data JPA, and how JPA will generate the additional table, which is this particular table, course student course table, who will map the primary key of both other relationship. Okay, so this is what all about Spring Data JPA we can use, and as per my experience, I believe maximum scenario is being developed by many to many in real time. So just focus on this annotation and try to play with this particular annotation. Create one more scenario instead of course and student. You can take something like customer and list of product, such kind of scenario, and you can give it a try. Okay, that's all about this particular video, guys. Thanks for watching this video. Meet you soon with a new concept.